We do have at least one wound that is a very good candidate for being fatal. Important because it was important for Henry's side to be able to show that Richard actually was dead. There's always a potential with these things that somebody's going to turn up 6 months down the line with an army at their back claiming to be the person. And so it was very important that Henry VII could show that he really had killed Richard and Richard was never going to be able to come into power again.
They found King Richard III buried under a parking lot, and when they opened his grave, what they discovered left scientists absolutely speechless. His skeleton revealed something so shocking, so horrifying, that it rewrote 500 years of history in an instant. A twisted spine hiding a dark secret, a skull crushed in ways that'll make your blood run cold, and a DNA test that exposed a truth nobody was prepared for.
An archaeologist, I think my prime motivation originally was because we would learn more about a site in Leicester, the Greyfriars, that we didn't know anything at all about previously. For example, here there were gardens on the site in the 17th and 18th century, and then later the gardens became a car park, so it came down straight away onto a high-status medieval building.
In August 1485, a battle took place in the English countryside that would change the course of history. King Richard III, the last English monarch to die in combat, fell at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor era. But what happened to his body after the battle would remain one of history's greatest mysteries for over 5 centuries. After Richard was killed, his corpse was stripped and slung over a horse. His enemy, Henry Tudor, who had just declared himself the new King Henry VII, ordered that Richard's body be taken to the nearby town of Leicester. There, it was put on public display for several days so that everyone could see that the old king was truly dead. This wasn't an act of respect, it was a political statement. Henry needed to prove beyond any doubt that Richard was gone and that he was now in charge. According to historical records from the time, Richard's body was eventually buried at the Greyfriars Church in Leicester. The burial was reportedly simple and without much ceremony, which wasn't surprising given that he had just been defeated by the man who was now king. A monument was later placed above his grave, marking the spot where one of England's most controversial monarchs lay. For a few decades, people knew exactly where Richard III was buried. The church kept records, and locals were aware of the grave's location. But then something happened that would throw everything into chaos. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII began what historians call the dissolution of the monasteries. This was a period when Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and started shutting down religious institutions across England. Over the course of just 5 years, hundreds of monasteries, churches, and religious houses were closed. Many were completely demolished, their stones carted off and used for other building projects. The Greyfriars Church in Leicester was among those that didn't survive. Once the church was gone, the land where it had stood was eventually sold off. The mayor of Leicester at the time bought the property and built a mansion on the site. Here's where things get interesting. Even though the original monument marking Richard's grave had been destroyed along with the church, the mayor apparently knew exactly where the king had been buried. He cared enough about this piece of history to erect his own monument on his property, marking the spot where Richard lay beneath the ground. For several decades, this new monument served as a reminder of where the last Plantagenet king rested. People who knew about it could point to the mayor's garden and say with confidence that Richard III was buried right there. But in 1611, something happened that would completely derail the truth and send historians on a wild chase that would last for centuries. A historian named John Speed published an account that told a very different story. According to Speed's version of events, when the Greyfriars Church was demolished during Henry VIII's purge of Catholic institutions, an angry mob had dug up Richard's body. They then supposedly threw his remains into the River Soar and reburied them under a bridge called Bow Bridge. It was a dramatic story, full of anger and revenge, and it captured people's imaginations. The problem was that nobody really knew where Speed had gotten this information. There were no earlier accounts that mentioned anything about a mob desecrating Richard's grave. There were no contemporary records of his body being moved to the river. But despite the lack of evidence, people began to believe Speed's story. Perhaps it seemed plausible given how unpopular Richard had been in some circles, or maybe it just made for a better tale than the truth. Whatever the reason, over time this story became accepted as fact. By the 1800s, Speed's account had become so widely believed that it was treated as historical truth. Eventually, someone even placed a plaque near Bow Bridge, claiming that this was where King Richard III had been buried. The plaque became a minor tourist attraction, and people would visit the spot to pay their respects to the fallen king. Then, a few years after the plaque was installed, workers found a skeleton in the river near the bridge. Many people immediately jumped to the conclusion that they had discovered the actual remains of Richard III. The skeleton was examined, but there was no way to definitively prove or disprove the claim at that time, so the mystery only deepened. As the 20th century arrived and then progressed, the true location of Richard III had become completely lost to history. The mayor's mansion that had once marked his actual grave was long gone, demolished at some point, and replaced by other buildings. The Greyfriars Church, which had been his original burial site, was now buried under multiple layers of urban development. Leicester had grown and changed dramatically over the centuries. Roads had been built, buildings had gone up and come down, and the medieval street layout had been altered beyond recognition. By the early 2000s, if you had asked historians where Richard III was buried, you would have gotten different answers. Some still believed the Bow Bridge story. Others thought his remains were simply lost forever, scattered or destroyed centuries ago. A few suspected he might still be somewhere under modern Leicester, but finding him seemed impossible. The city had been built and rebuilt so many times that any attempt to locate a specific medieval grave would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. But then members of the Richard III Society, a group dedicated to researching and rehabilitating the king's reputation, decided to seriously investigate. They weren't content with legends and half-truths. They wanted to find out what had really happened to Richard's body, and if possible, locate his actual remains. This was an ambitious goal, but they had something that previous generations didn't have access to: modern technology and research methods. The research team knew they had to start by going back through all the historical records and really examining the evidence. They needed to trace the story of what happened after Richard was buried and figure out where the truth had gotten lost along the way. One of the first things they did was take a closer look at John Speed's famous story about the body being thrown under Bow Bridge. When they dug into Speed's background, they discovered something fascinating. In 1611, the same year his account was published, Speed had actually traveled to Leicester specifically to search for Richard's grave. He had also created a detailed map of the city during his visit. The researchers obtained a copy of this map and studied it carefully. What they found was remarkable. Speed's map showed the location of the Greyfriars Church, but when the researchers compared it to other historical maps and records, they realized something was wrong. Speed had drawn the Greyfriars Church in the wrong location. He had actually marked it where a different religious building, the Blackfriars Church, had stood. The two churches had similar names, which might have caused the confusion. This mistake explained everything. When Speed went looking for Richard's grave, he had gone to the wrong place. He had searched the area around where he thought Greyfriars had been, found nothing but an overgrown field with no monument, and concluded that the grave must have been lost or moved. If he had gone to the correct location, he would have found the mayor's mansion with its monument clearly marking where Richard was buried. So why did Speed publish the story about the body being thrown in the river? The researchers found a clue to this as well. They discovered records of a local priest who had actually been dug up and thrown into the River Soar years before Speed's visit. It seems likely that Speed heard this story, mixed it up with his failed search for Richard's grave, and created a narrative that combined the two. Whether he intended to mislead people or simply made an honest mistake is impossible to say, but the result was the same. His false story had sent historians off course for 400 years. With Speed's account thoroughly debunked, the research team could now focus their efforts on finding the actual location of Greyfriars Church. This was going to be extremely challenging, because any physical evidence of the church had been buried under centuries of development. They would need to use historical maps to try to pinpoint where the church had stood and then figure out what modern buildings now occupied that space. The oldest detailed map the research team could find dated back to 1741. By that time, the Greyfriars Church had been gone for about 200 years, but the map showed the area where it had once stood. At that point in history, the site was occupied by the mayor's mansion and its surrounding gardens. The monument that had marked Richard's grave would have been somewhere within this property, though the exact spot wasn't marked on the map. The researchers then began the painstaking work of overlaying more modern maps on top of the 1741 version. This technique allowed them to see how the area had changed over time. They could trace the gradual transformation of the landscape as buildings went up and came down, as roads were constructed, and as the city expanded. What they discovered was that a road had eventually been built right through the middle of where the Greyfriars area had been. Modern buildings had sprouted up on top of what used to be the mansion's gardens. By the 21st century, the Greyfriars area had been almost completely swallowed up by urban development. Office buildings, shops, and various other structures covered most of the land. The few remaining bits of open space had been paved over and turned into parking lots. It seemed like an unlikely place to find a 500-year-old grave, but the research pointed to this being the right location. In 2005, a woman named Philippa Langley, who had been leading much of the research effort, decided to visit one of these parking lots in person. She wanted to see the site with her own eyes and get a sense of the place. As she walked around the asphalt lot, she experienced what she would later describe as a strong intuition that she was in the right place. Then something caught her eye that gave her chills. Painted on the asphalt was a large letter R. It marked a reserved parking space, nothing more than a mundane piece of modern parking lot infrastructure. But to Philippa, in that moment, it felt like a sign. She became convinced that if they were going to dig anywhere, they should start right there, near that painted letter. It was an unusual way to choose an excavation site, based partly on intuition and partly on what seemed like pure coincidence, but she couldn't shake the feeling. It would take several more years before Philippa and her team could actually begin digging. They needed to get permission from the property owners, secure funding, and assemble a team of professional archaeologists. Archaeological excavations are expensive, and the team had limited resources. They could only afford to dig up a small fraction of the parking lot, which meant they had to be strategic about where they placed their trenches. The archaeologists knew from their research that medieval churches were typically built with a specific orientation. They were positioned from east to west, with the altar at the east end. Using this knowledge, along with their historical maps and calculations, they planned to dig 3 separate trenches. If they had calculated correctly, these trenches should intersect with at least part of the old church structure. It was a careful plan, but there were no guarantees. They were essentially making educated guesses about what lay beneath several feet of modern pavement and soil. On August 25, 2012, exactly 527 years after Richard III had been buried, the excavation team began work on the first trench. The project was expected to take about 2 weeks. The archaeologists were hoping to find some evidence of the church itself, perhaps walls or foundations. Finding an actual grave seemed like an incredibly long shot. After all, they were looking for one specific burial site in what would have been a large church that had contained many graves. But then something remarkable happened. Just 6 hours into the first day of digging, they found human remains. The skeleton was located just a few meters away from that painted letter R that had caught Philippa's attention years earlier. The archaeologists carefully began to expose the bones, and as they did, they noticed something unusual. The skull showed signs of major trauma, and the spine had a distinctive curve to it. This curved spine was particularly significant. Historical accounts of Richard III often described him as having a hunched back, or one shoulder being noticeably higher than the other. For centuries, some historians had dismissed these descriptions as propaganda spread by his enemies, particularly the Tudors who had defeated him and wanted to portray him as physically deformed and morally corrupt. But here was physical evidence that Richard did indeed have a curved spine, a condition known as scoliosis. The damage to the skull was also telling. Historical records stated that Richard had died in battle, and the injuries to the skull were consistent with wounds that could have been inflicted during combat. There were cuts and puncture marks that suggested blows from weapons. Everything about the skeleton matched what they would expect to find if it really was Richard III. But the team knew they couldn't rely on these observations alone. They needed scientific proof. The archaeologists carefully removed the skeleton and transported it to the University of Leicester for detailed analysis. The team planned to use every modern scientific technique available to them to determine whether this was really the king. One of the most important methods would be DNA testing. But this presented its own unique challenges. To use DNA testing to identify the skeleton, they needed to compare it with DNA from a known descendant of Richard III. The problem was finding such a person. Richard himself had died without any legitimate children who survived to have families of their own. The researchers would need to find descendants through other branches of his family tree. And this is where things got complicated. The best type of DNA for this kind of historical identification is mitochondrial DNA. This is genetic material that gets passed down through the maternal line. A mother passes her mitochondrial DNA to all her children, but only her daughters can pass it on to the next generation. Sons receive it but don't transmit it. This means that for the DNA test to work, there would need to be an unbroken line of female descendants connecting Richard III to someone alive today. The research team began the meticulous work of tracing Richard's family tree, specifically looking for lines of female descent. They couldn't trace through Richard himself because he had no surviving children, so instead, they looked at his siblings. Richard had an older sister, and if they could trace a line of female descendants from her, all the way to the present day, they might be able to find someone whose mitochondrial DNA would match Richard's. Amazingly, they succeeded. The genealogists were able to trace 16 generations of female descendants from Richard's sister. This line led to a woman named Joy Brown. Unfortunately, Joy had passed away, but she had a son named Michael Ibsen who was still alive. The same mitochondrial DNA that Richard had inherited from his mother should have been passed down through his sister's female line all the way to Joy Brown, and then to Michael. However, there was a significant risk here. If even one link in this long chain of 16 generations was incorrect, if there had been any unknown adoptions or instances where the recorded father wasn't the biological father, the whole thing would fall apart. To make their case more solid, the researchers decided to trace a second line of female descent from Richard's family. They found another branch that led to a woman named Wendy Duldig. By comparing DNA from both Michael Ibsen and Wendy Duldig, the scientists could verify that these two people were indeed related to each other through their shared maternal ancestry. This would provide additional confidence that they had traced the family tree correctly, and that both were genuine descendants of Richard III's mother. Before extracting DNA from the skeleton, the team sent bone samples to be carbon dated. This is a technique that can determine how old organic material is. All living things absorb a type of carbon called carbon-14 from the environment while they're alive. When an organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon-14, and the carbon-14 that's already in the body begins to decay at a known steady rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a bone sample, scientists can calculate approximately how long ago that person died. When the initial carbon dating results came back, they showed something puzzling. The skeleton appeared to be several decades older than Richard III would have been. This was concerning because if the dates didn't match, it would suggest they had found someone else entirely. But the scientists noticed something else in their analysis. The chemical composition of the bones indicated that this person had eaten a diet very rich in seafood and other proteins. In medieval England, such a diet would have been expensive and available only to the wealthy and nobility. Common people ate mostly bread, vegetables, and occasionally some meat, but fresh fish and seafood were luxuries. So while the diet didn't prove this was Richard, it did indicate that whoever this person was, they had lived a high-status life, which was consistent with them being a king. More importantly, this dietary information had implications for carbon dating. When someone regularly eats a lot of seafood, especially fish from the ocean, it can affect the amount of carbon-14 in their bones. This is because old carbon from the ocean gets incorporated into their bodies, which can make carbon dating results appear older than they actually are. Scientists call this the marine reservoir effect. When the researchers recalculated the carbon dating results to account for this seafood-heavy diet, the numbers changed significantly. The adjusted dates now showed that the skeleton was almost certainly from the right time period to be Richard III. The dates were consistent with someone who had died in 1485. Finally, the DNA results came back from the laboratory. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skeleton was compared with samples from Michael Ibsen and Wendy Doldig. The results showed a clear match. The skeleton carried the same mitochondrial DNA as both of the living descendants. The probability that this was just a coincidence was extraordinarily small. Taking all the evidence together, the curved spine that matched historical descriptions, the battle wounds to the skull, the carbon dating that placed the death in the right time period, the high-status diet, and most conclusively, the DNA match. The scientists could say with near certainty that they had found King Richard III. After more than 500 years, the mystery of what happened to the last Plantagenet king had finally been solved. He hadn't been thrown into a river. He hadn't been lost or destroyed. He had been exactly where the early records said he was, buried beneath Greyfriars Church, just waiting to be found under a parking lot in Leicester.